We're handing out the final exam review questions. The exam is 2 weeks from today. Told you you'd get the questions in advance. There are 12 review questions. The final exam, we will choose, I suspect, 3 of them, and you will be asked to answer 2, is my guess. And then there are 12. You'll look on both sides.
Would there be identifications?
There will probably be identifications as well. I have not decided on that. Okay. I'll keep you off the streets. The discussion leaders have asked in particular that I emphasize the note at the top of the page, in particular that we will look for answers that develop an argument with specific evidence drawn both from readings and lectures. Your answers must draw upon readings, not just lectures, and will be penalized significantly if they do not do so. I was asked to add that. Okay? So they want to see you using your readings and making specific references. And many of the essays ask you to do that quite specifically, but you can expect at least that even if the question itself does not always ask you quite specifically to do so, it means to do so.
I'll make more copies. There's not enough to make more copies.
Oh, okay. The copy machine must have miscounted, so it stopped running. There are 12 on both sides. You're welcome, as I've suggested before, to form study groups and talk these things through, but on the exam, you unfortunately do have to do them on your own. Okay? You may bring in a 3x5 card with all the usual dribble on it that you want, names, dates, facts that you're anxious about not remembering. Just put them on the card, preferably there rather than on the back of your palm or in ink. Okay? Any questions before we begin? Yes?
Will there be a short answer part of that classroom?
Most likely. Most likely. I'll try to tell you that by next Monday, at least, after I've had a chance to talk with the discussion leaders.
So, out of these 12, 2 will be picked.
You will be expected to answer at least 2, and there will be some choice. That's to say, it's not unlikely that we'll say, answer question 7 and either 9 or 10. So there will be some choice. But it's possible that part of the exam will have no choice. But you will have had all the questions 2 weeks ahead of time. So we expect, wonderful answers. You'll have time to put them together. We're not interested in trying to trick you up. We're interested in your showing us what you know. So that's the idea. All right, the game 4 ends today. Wednesday, the answers should be handed in to game 4. I'm going to review the 5 fragments, not all of which were put up in order because of the problems we've had with PowerPoint from time to time. This is fragment 1. They're all on Blackboard in some order or another, so just identify what you're looking at. That's fragment 1. These are all Soho. They're all within close, reasonable proximity of one another in Soho. And they're on the pretty northern part, more northern part of Soho. Again, there's a kind of small grade boost for all of these, and many of you don't need it, and some of you will benefit from it. Number 2. Number 3, the Great White Lady. Number 4, and the story attending this building in its early 19th century past. And number 5, where many of you have been from time to time. Okay, we're moving into the end of the 60s and the early 70s today. And we're focusing on 3 events. Take place in the spring of 1968, then 1969, and then 1970 in rapid succession. And I want to suggest how the 3 together reflected, if not help generate, both reflect and generate, a basic shift in New York City's political culture and realignments of the social groups and the political forces that characterize these social groupings in New York City, from backlash to the transformations of the 1960s and the politics of the 60s, and come to characterize much of the political culture of the city from roughly the mid-70s until today. We begin with an incident that many of you know about. I know some of you are writing about. Ocean Hill, Brownsville, May 1968. 1968, many of you know, is a year about which books have been written. Just with the title 1968 already signifies to many people a year of tremendous political ferment. In the United States, it was associated with, among other things, the turmoil surrounding the Chicago Convention and an election. But there were student upheavals and rebellions all across Europe and around the world. Central America, Mexico City, Paris, and across the United States in that year. Ocean Hill, Brownsville, unlike so many of the others, was not campus turmoil. It did not involve large numbers of students. In that sense, it in fact shows the penetration of the upheaval through society and the ways it becomes articulated. The anxieties that were associated with that upheaval penetrated, among other things, the school system and daily life in local communities. On May 8th, 1968, 10 teachers in Brooklyn's predominantly black Ocean Hill, Brownsville school district all got letters from the Board of Education, from the local community. They were all to be fired. All the teachers were members of the United Federation of Teachers, the union representing teachers. 9 out of 10 of them were white, and the majority were Jewish. Only 10 got those letters. In fact, the Board of Education actually was ultimately prepared to fire, this was just the tip of the iceberg, was prepared to fire 13 white teachers and 6 administrators, all from that district. Again, virtually we're all Jewish. And they weren't entirely being fired, they were being asked to move to other districts. The issue for the union was jobs, but as important and more fundamentally, control of the workplace. Who would decide on who was to do the work? Was it to be the union? In this case, was it to be the teachers, who had spent careers establishing professional credentials, supposedly, and thinking through what a curriculum would look like, who was best prepared to teach, etc.? Or was it to be the local community board that represented the parents and had a sense of what they wanted their children to learn? The immediate result, however, was a strike. And it was a strike not simply in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, but because it was a strike of the teachers' union that represented teachers across the entire city, and because teachers were in fact being moved from Ocean Hill, Brownsville to other parts of the city, the UFT launched a citywide strike that lasted almost 2 months, not to say the end of the semester, and affected about 1 million school children across the entire city. It was one of the more bitter conflicts in the city's history, though we've seen some pretty bitter conflicts, if we think back at the draft riots. But it raised charges of racism from both sides. That's to say, was the curriculum racist? Was the community board racist in firing the teachers? It raised questions about union busting that had been a struggle that the unions had fought against in the late 40s and was a legacy of McCarthyism that the 60s felt they had finally put to bed, put to sleep, put behind them. And it raised, for many, in the union in particular, the specter of anti-Semitism. Ultimately, as you'll see, the result would be a reconfiguration, historians have argued, and I think correctly so, of the ethnic and political alliances in the city. That's to say, the extent to which political alliances often took ethnic and class and ethno-racial terms. That's to say, the African American community, the Hispanic community, the Jewish community, the Irish community, the Italian community, all tended at different moments of times to be aligned with different political groups in the same way that we'd seen that the working class, which at different times was substantially Irish and then Italian and then Jewish, also aligned with the Democratic Party in Tammany Hall. And white Anglo-Saxon Protestants and more elites and business interests at some times aligned themselves with the Republican Party. And at other times, white ethnics also aligned with the Republican Party, and some business elites aligned themselves with the Democratic Party. So there wasn't a simple configuration, but at different moments there was quite clear configurations. This gets recharged in ways that will, or reshaped ways that will characterize the next 4 decades. Now, the origins of the transformation that we're talking about are not simply 1968. Part of what's interesting when you write your papers is, where do you begin the story? Do you begin it on May 8th? Do the events simply begin May 8th as if everything is de novo, nothing precedes that? And I want to suggest that, in fact, there's a context for the events of May 8th. There are already a set of transformations that have unleashed anxieties, that have made people wary about certain kinds of changes. And it won't surprise you that I'll begin this story in the post-war era around deindustrialization and job security in the city. Questions about job security, about what did a job mean. Remember, we've talked about how important it was not just to have a job, but be able to use a job that gave you job security, where you didn't worry about losing your job, about having simply seasonal labor, about being fired. And you wanted a job that sometimes did not pay the highest wage or salary, but sometimes provided other perks like status in the community, or just a good living wage, or the ability to know that within that labor sector, the power that you had was to also get your kid a job in the union. Okay? So social mobility took many forms, but jobs mattered. New York City, we've seen, had already after World War II begun to lose, and certainly this was true by 1968, about half the skilled and semi-skilled manufacturing jobs in the city. Remember the garment industry. Garment is still there, still more garment jobs in New York than any place else, but half the jobs that had once been there are no longer there. They're in the South. And increasingly, they were going to be jobs that were going to be farmed out to South and East Asia as well. These were jobs that had been traditional routes for upward social mobility for ethnics, for immigrants that came to New York, and for black migrants. Both black and white looked for jobs in these industries. New white-collar jobs were emerging, but they often required skills that were, among other things, closed to many of the blacks who came from rural areas. They were more open to some of the white ethnics than they were to African Americans. That's one context. That's to say, the job market. What did it mean to be talking about equal opportunity when, in fact, jobs were disappearing? And remember that the war on poverty involved programs like Equal Opportunity and Head Start. in which kids would be given programs through kindergarten, supposedly, to provide them with the skills that would allow them to enter the job market. Or there would be programs created in the federal government through the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission to make sure that there were not discriminatory practices. But what did it mean to have these institutions in place if there weren't jobs at the other end? And increasingly, what was, or what we know wasn't always apparent then, but we know in retrospect, looking back at the data, was that many of the jobs for which they were being prepared were contracting. That labor sector was contracting during this period and would contract even more in the 70s, which quickly became associated with words like deindustrialization. The second process is the struggle for social justice, in particular for minorities. And that struggle for social justice had gained enormous support from the Great Society programs. There had been an effort to counter what had been in fact a falling away during the 50s from concerns with social programs. There was a re-energizing, especially with all the social protests, to meet some of the concerns with social protests. Great Society programs were put in place. Many middle-class whites, however, felt that they were excluded from those programs, that programs focused on the poor rather than the just getting by, as it were. So the programs seemed to focus on concerns of minorities, and we saw the vast expansion I mentioned last time about the welfare rolls as an example of that. But whites increasingly began to feel that they were paying taxes that were not in fact equally benefiting them. That the programs, increasingly in '68, Richard Nixon runs a campaign arguing that the people who have been forgotten are people he calls middle America, and argues that these programs are privileging minorities who have been, quote, the, quote, underprivileged in the past. A very, by the way, particular use of term. These people were not the exploited, they weren't the discriminated, they were the underprivileged. Very particular, interesting language suggests how they were understanding the problem. But even as that was programs for the underprivileged were being created, people were arguing we are in fact being discriminated against because it's privileging others. And of course there was an increased threat or notion that the cities had become arenas of violence. Social protest for one person is violent lawlessness for someone else. Between 1940 and 65, the black population in New York City triples. At the same time, between 60 and 65, the crime rate in the city skyrockets. Now, part of it we know subsequently has to do with poverty and increasing alternative form of social mobility, which was drug trade. That poor black communities increasingly turn to cocaine as a form of social mobility, as a way of providing jobs and a way of providing a fast buck. But of course, the downside is it also led to people who were out of their mind, people who were engaged in the increasingly desperate dependence on drugs and desperate needs then for money. If you didn't get a copy of the exam questions, could you just raise your hands in the back and we'll bring them to the back. Thank you. The black population not only expands dramatically, it needs to find housing, and it begins to move into neighborhoods that had earlier been singularly white. That process from the white community's perspective was seen as encroachment rather than mobility. New programs now began not simply to mobilize blacks, but also to think about how blacks could be given a head start. We talked about the Ford Foundation funding mobilization for youth in the late 50s and how that led into the war on poverty and active community organizing within the African American communities. But the Ford Foundation also funded new experiments with education. In the summer of '67, with Ford Foundation funding, the Board of Education begins a new experiment in what was to be called community control. We talked last time, as you remember at the end of the last lecture, how coming out of the lessons of Saul Alinsky and others, people were trying to argue that people would be more responsible, it was believed, if in fact they felt that they had more control over their everyday lives, if they could bear some responsibility for their own community's life and livelihood. And based on that principle, the Ford Foundation funded this program that would allow school districts to elect their own local boards to have a say in how schools would be run, so that schools would not be uniform everywhere, but could be tailored to meet the different needs of different communities, was the thinking. And that parents would buy into the education because they would be involved in it, rather than thinking it was something that teachers would take care of, that they had no relationship with, that it was being handled by others. They could feel that we're invested in it, we have an involvement in it, we need to get involved in the school system. So that was the logic that was behind this kind of program. For white ethnics, it meant, however, a view that on top of increased benefits, on top of new programs targeted to help the poor, who were disproportionately in New York African Americans, not in Appalachia, there are plenty of white poor in America, but not in New York in the same numbers. Increasingly, these people, white ethnics, many of whom, by the way, had sons and nephews who were fighting in Vietnam, begin to feel that equality for minorities was at the expense of inequality for them. So we end up with two groups with very different views of what was happening in the late 60s. From the perspective of the local school boards, of the communities, they believed that the curriculum that their kids were receiving was a white curriculum. It was a curriculum that ignored the history of African Americans and ignored black life. It wasn't in that sense very different than what was happening at universities, where students like at NYU were arguing there ought to be an urban studies curriculum, or women were arguing we ought to have a curriculum that deals with gender and sexuality studies and women's studies. Or at the universities they were saying we need to have a program in African American history. And in fact, if we really want to understand the city and understand them, we need to make an effort to get them into our classroom. We don't have a real dialogue without hearing their voices. So those things are happening at universities as well as what's going on within the community. The local board, moreover, not only saw that these absences in the curriculum, they placed at the feet of the people who had been running the schools before that. And they saw that as teachers who had been privileged by civil service exams that had been created by white people and asked questions that white folks could understand. That they were white exams for white folks that were leaving black folks out of the civil service process and therefore out of the teachers' union. That's the logic having. It's not unlike the questions many of you have heard about whether the SAT exams or other exams privilege certain kinds of training and language, training and experiences. In sum, from the perspective of the local community board, the issue of control was an issue about who gets to teach and what do they get to teach. Okay? What does it mean to be a learned person? What are the things one needs to know about in order to be educated? The union's view was very different. To them, the question of control of the schools was plain and simply a question of professionalism, among other things. That's to say, it was a prerogative of teachers who had vast experience and had specialized in learning about these kinds of problems, about what it meant to be a teacher. That it didn't come simply by living in the community. It came from understanding pedagogy. It came from understanding the history of the United States and studying such subjects. They believed also that the civil service exam had in fact gotten minorities jobs in the past. The minorities had included Italians and Jews and Catholics and Irish and others who had earlier been excluded. That's to say, the teachers in American school systems at the turn of the century had been all Anglo-Saxon white folks. And it was a process of change over time that had finally won these earlier groups that had been the minorities a foothold in the curriculum. And the civil service exam had provided a measure of control over that process so that it wasn't subject simply to white ethnic politicians or white folks giving jobs to other white folks, but rather it was now a fair process that was not politicized, but in fact was supposed to be objective. From their perspective, the union's perspective, the civil service exam was a hallmark of fairness and progress. And finally, from the union's perspective, the attack on the teachers was a not so veiled attack on Jews. That the problem wasn't, from they understood it, that the curriculum was white, it's that Jews were teaching it. The struggle, as you can imagine, now was going to realign old antagonists who had in fact earlier worked together and create new ones. Realigned old protagonists, groups that had worked together and create new antagonisms. There had been a, well, at least public notion of an alliance between blacks and Jews in civil rights and in housing in New York City. Many of the local school boards, school districts, many of the local housing areas, especially in the white suburbs, Westchester County, had discriminated equally against both Jews and blacks. And there had been an alliance by many of the leaders of the Jewish organizations with leaders of the black organizations in protesting and in trying to move for fair housing laws that would alleviate some of that pattern of discrimination. In addition, it should be noted that the conflict is not simply Jews and blacks. There were Jewish, especially left-wing Jews within the Union who did not completely agree with the Union on this side, who did not support the Union's protest. There were Jewish teachers and Jewish leftists who supported community control and have been active in the support of community control. And it should be noted, some black leaders did attack Jewish unions, as well as Jewish merchants who had historically been in their community, but other black leaders had aligned themselves with the Jewish community. But in '68, those allegiances begin to have very sharp public cleavages now. The community board wins the support from Mayor Lindsay, but he, of course, is seen as a patrician, white Anglo-Saxon from the Silk Stocking district, a liberal Manhattanite, which is what he was. He, in fact, wins largely as an independent, as a mayor. The Board of Education, the Ford Foundation, and upper middle class left liberal community, mostly in Manhattan, all aligns itself, not to a person, but substantially aligns itself disproportionately with the community. These were people who were supporting the idea of community control. Teachers, the majority of teachers in the Union, and middle and lower middle class in the outer boroughs, in particular those not in Ocean Hill-Brownsville, but in outer boroughs, especially in Queens and other parts of Brooklyn, find new allies and do not associate with this elite Manhattan upper class, or elite as they see it, left community in support of community control. The outer borough white ethnics increasingly now see themselves in an antagonistic position with the white elites, or what they associate as white elites in Manhattan, or a certain kind of Manhattanite liberalism that's associated with the African American community control in minorities in these communities. The outer boroughs increasingly develop a sense of resentment against what had been seen as the privileging by often these white elites, who are also, they associate with protest against the war and with civil rights and advancing the Great Society and advancing the African American community and coddling a community that they now feel is violent and threatening their lives and is now taking over their schools and moving into their neighborhoods or moving nearby. They, in fact, their resentment is often, in fact, shared by members of other labor forces that also are now being told by the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission that they need to consider jobs for minorities. The two areas that were targeted most by the EEOC were the construction unions, that you may recall were almost all white men, and they become a target increasingly part for African Americans, but increasingly for women's jobs as well, and the police and firemen, who now become firefighters, and police. It won't surprise you that those people also disproportionately live in the outer borough communities. These are people who largely can't afford to live in Manhattan, among other things, and they come out of white ethnic communities that are in fact often based in the outer boroughs. And those police, in particular, had been in fact had in these earlier years been called upon to break strikes by teachers and other unions, now find themselves wanting to align themselves with the teachers against the black community. Another form of alliance that's worth noting at this point is the relationship is now between Catholics and Jews, which had been strained in the 50s, in the 60s, when Catholics saw Jews as associated with communism and they saw communists as anti-Catholic. And so there were strains in those relationships which extended to issues like birth control and family planning, which there were vast differences, in which the Jewish community tended to be at the forefront of organizing within those movements, and the Catholic community increasingly unwilling and hostile to those kinds of changes. Now there's a new alliance. The Catholics in the outer boroughs share the Jewish teachers' views and form new alliances with them. Again, we're not talking to person, we're talking about broad-scale political alliances. Now, partially, this is facilitated by the fact that Cardinal Spellman is no longer in charge. He has died, and he's been replaced by Cardinal Cook in 1967, who goes out of his way to reach out to the Jewish community in a way in which Cardinal Spellman had not. In addition, from the other side, Jewish politicians like Ed Koch and Abe Beame had begun their own kind of rightward transition themselves. Remember, we had talked about how Koch had been a beatnik, as it were, playing guitar in Washington Square Park during the 50s and 60s. He increasingly begins, this will be more pronounced in the 1970s, a rightward shift, and he reaches out to Catholics for political alliances and votes. It becomes the origins of what will become the new neoconservatives, or the neocons, which Koch becomes aligned around an organization in New York known as the Manhattan Institute that to this day basically trained most of New York politicians. Most of them remain members of this thing called the Manhattan Institute. Democrats and Republicans, with the exception of Dinkins is the one hiccup in this process by and large. But it remains true of Bloomberg, Giuliani, and Koch. The alliance, it should be noted, doesn't simply happen in 1968. There are already inklings of it earlier in the 63, 64, when Black Power becomes the forefront of people's consciousness. Jews and Catholics in Queens and in Brooklyn had come together as early as 63, 64 to form something called PAT, P-A-T, which was Parents and Taxpayers, or Don't Stand Pat. It was a militant anti-busing organization that tried to prevent African-American kids being bused into their neighborhoods to integrate schools. Remember, we've talked about how the South is easily identified as the home of segregation, but segregated patterns were de facto in northern cities as well. Okay? They came from housing, they came from redlining by the banks, which New York banks did all the time. It came from realtors that did redlining as well in all the housing areas, and it came from homeowners didn't want their housing values to be jeopardized by who lived next door. That's why you would have movies at the time that would be things like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, sort of thing. Okay? New York City school integration efforts are in fact largely defeated in the late 60s by this alliance from the outer boroughs. By 1966, outer borough Jews and Catholics also unite to defeat the Civilian Review Board, which was an effort by the liberal community based largely again out of Manhattan to create a civilian-based board to evaluate allegations about police brutality. So here we again see an alliance between the police and outer borough white ethnics, whose earlier alliance was as Catholic and Jews is now beginning to shift, where it's now a kind of common alliance that they have as defending whiteness in these boroughs, keeping out people with busing, maintaining the purity of white neighborhoods as people are looking for new housing, and defeating any civilian review board that can jeopardize the authority and power of their police force, which is their brothers and their uncles and their neighbors, to defend their interests, the white ethnic interests. Ocean Hill-Brownsville struggle as a fact in that context affirms a new alliance of Jews, in the words of the most recent historical account, Jews becoming effectively white as a primary identity, not simply as Jews in this struggle. In the sense that they can form an alliance with Catholics. Their alliance is not that they're Jews and Catholics, it's that they have this common alliance, allegiance of themselves as the white other against this foreign minority. The new political alliance marks a shift in the balance to the outer boroughs that will mark the 70s and through the present. Ed Koch will win on that balance, win their support, and it will affect a new kind of democratic, neoconservative, and Republican alliance against the Democratic liberals in Manhattan. It will be paralleled, of course, on the federal level in the backlash represented by the election of Richard Nixon in 1968. And then Ronald Reagan, of course, through the 70s. By mid-November 1968, it should be noted that the teachers would be reinstated and Ocean Hill-Brownsville community control experiment would be discontinued shortly thereafter. And in years to come, Jewish and Catholic neighborhoods would in fact stand shoulder to shoulder, whether it would be in Canarsie or in Forest Hills, to keep blacks out of their neighborhoods and schools. And obviously you'll be reading about some of those struggles. But I want to turn to two other struggles briefly. They involve issues around sexuality. The next is a struggle that erupts the next year, the following spring, almost to the date, though it's June of '69. And it will be at a bar in Greenwich Village. The background is to understand that there were new groups arising and emerging in New York City and in Lower Manhattan, developing and again placing New York City in the forefront of the liberal imaginary as the place where people were willing to entertain and consider possibilities that the rest of the country thought were beyond the ken. Women working in construction, how bizarre. Women's liberation is a national movement, but nowhere is it stronger than in places like New York City. There were influential and particularly radical feminist groups of the '60s based in New York City, and they produced many of the expressions and actions that became household words in the United States. Sisterhood is powerful. Consciousness raising. The personal is political. The politics of housework. The pro-woman line. And most famously, the Miss America protest of 1967 to '69, or bra burning. All of these have particular vocal origins and strength in New York City. Many members, these women, had been active in SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, and they resented the patriarchy and paternalism of male leadership that was only too willing. And remember, even in the video you saw, it's men that you're seeing in that video from NYU, not women. Women were there. Somebody, after all, had to go make the coffee. And the women said, exactly, that's the problem. The first to form was a group called New York Radical Women, in the fall of 1967. And it does so with the tool of consciousness raising. It's founded by Shulamith Firestone and Pam Allen, but among its early leaders are Roz Baxendall. She still lives in Washington Square Village. Ellen Willis, who taught at NYU until she died a few years ago prematurely of cancer in the journalism department. She didn't die in the journalism department, she taught in the journalism department. Let me get my syntax correct there, please. The journalism department can do many things, but it has not killed very many people. Ellen Willis, and lastly, I'm sorry, Robin Morgan, who you may remember from the I Remember Mama. She's the daughter in I Remember Mama. All are active in this organization. They formed something called the Red Stockings in February of '69, after the breakup of New York Radical Women. The group was started by Ellen Willis and Firestone. Mainly active in New York City, where most of the group's members existed. I'm not going to discuss them at great length today, but rather to suggest that they become very important in the development of lesbian separatism. Even though they themselves are opposed to it, they help to create a kind of new consciousness and assertion by women, both gay women and straight women, that they have rights. Gay women gain much of their strength, in fact, from gay men and from the struggle in the gay men's movement that is earlier much more politically engaged than that of gay women. Because there had been a long history, gay New York, and it was predominantly visible among men, though it existed among women as well. Women often lived in what were known as Boston marriages. That's to say, they were single women who often formed a fraternal and close relationship with another woman. We don't often know the details about their sexual behavior or what went on, except that they lived together in a quiet life that wasn't highly public, but never got married. And it was primarily among more elite women. We know very little about working class women in that story. We do know more about men. Prominent New Yorkers were gay, including the governor, who cross-dressed in the 18th century, as some of you know. In the 17th century, many young queer people felt isolated and alone across the country. They knew nonetheless to come to New York City, because already there was at least a public awareness that if New York City was not gay, it was tolerant, It was a place, especially in Greenwich Village, in Lower Manhattan, where you could give voice to ideas that elsewhere were thought to be beyond the ken. Here could be heard. There were quiet places where they could be practiced. You could find companions. You could find a supportive community, especially in a city that was this large. You could get lost among the numbers. So New York becomes a place apart from the rest of the country in that way again, for an opening for gay life. Between World War I and World War II, a Bohemian culture flourished in New York City, where sexual freedom had long been embraced. We had seen it as early as Fanny Wright, as you may recall, 1830, and Emma Goldman in the teens, the 19s, had all articulated these kinds of issues. We know as well that there were gay bathhouses and bars in which gay life was a common practice and tolerated all through New York in the early part of the 20th century. After World War II, gay servicemen stay on in New York City, where they found a supportive network and form a Veterans Benevolent Association where they can run dances and parties that could attract gay men. The women's clubs, as I've said, also exist. They're less well known and less visible. But lesbian bars, we know, also emerge in the immediate post-war era. The gay men institutionalize their new associations. The Mattachine Society forms in Los Angeles in 1951. A few years later, in New York City, it forms to help homosexuals in New York City deal with legal problems. That's to say, a lot of the early efforts are efforts that focus on legal struggles, legislative alliances. They're not taking to the streets, they're taking to the courts. Women form the Daughters of Bilious at approximately the same time in San Francisco, and a few years later it opens in a branch in New York City as well. The Oscar Wilde Bookshop opens in New York City in Greenwich Village in 1967, the first openly gay bookstore. And by the late 60s, the same time as we have upheavals arising around conscience raising, around women asserting new kinds of rights, the same time as we see people taking to the streets asserting their rights as black people in a community, we begin to have a new willingness of gay people to stand up for themselves. The problem was that gay people faced a lot of opposition, and it had been pretty virulent opposition, and it had always been in the mainstream, that opposition. As in fact queers begin to become more visible and take a public place and demand a public place, opposition to them hardens and becomes more vocal. It begins in the post-war era, when in 1952 the American Psychiatric Association lists homosexuality as, quote, a sociopathic personality disorder. The formal organization dedicated supposedly to understanding what constituted normality decides that gay life is abnormal and gives a professional veneer to that diagnosis. That, of course, makes things very difficult for gay men. Complicating their lives even further was hard political persecution. McCarthyism, not unlike, by the way, the Nazis, who also not simply made people wear yellow stars, but pink stars if you were gay. McCarthy period also singled out gay people, not just radicals. The fear of subversion was tied to the notion that unstable people, perversions by unstable people, would also make them liable to be seduced by communists. Hundreds of homosexuals, as a consequence, were fired in gay agencies, or you were fired if you, quote, looked gay, whatever that means. Thousands more were denied job applications. And of course, one of the things it forced people to do was to stay in the closet, if at all possible, or you face losing a job. 4,380 people were discharged from the military, and of course that's a struggle that continues to this day. The FBI went out of its way to track what it called known homosexuals. We, to this day, don't know what that category actually meant. But they outlawed anyone who was seen cross-dressing. Are there women here wearing pants? I'll leave you to think what that might mean yourself. Certainly in the 50s, you did not do so. You were not, of course, even allowed to do so. Okay? They shut down facilities catering to gay men and to gay women. The result, by the late 60s, was the first effort to push back by gay men. Saturday night, June 28th, 1969, there was a mafia-owned bar at 51-53 Christopher Street called the Stonewall Inn. It was owned by the Genovese family. Gay men were there in large numbers. Almost entirely male, 98% male, almost no women. Occasionally a transvestite or women, but almost all gay men, just gay men. They had suffered with monthly raids by the police, so another raid was not unusual in that sense. But on that night, 4 undercover police walk into the bar and announce, as they had month after month, "Police, we're taking the place." But this time, the response was different. In the past, the men had simply marched out and gone to jail. Another ritual of what it meant to be gay in New York, gone to jail and suffered the taunts, the ridicule, the harassment of the police. But not that night. A scuffle broke out. A crowd gathered outside and began to encourage resistance by applauding the men, the gay men. Cries began with song. We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved. Again, the song that had been the anthem of the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, now becomes the same song invoked by a new movement of gay men. With shouts echoing again those of black power, now of gay power, erupt in the streets. Michael Fader, one of those men, remembered, "We all had a collective feeling like we'd had enough of that kind of shit. It wasn't anything tangible anybody said to anybody else. It was just kind of like everything over the years had come to a head on that one particular night, in that one particular place. It was not an organized demonstration. Everyone in the crowd felt that we were just never going to go back. It was the last straw. It was time to reclaim something that had been taken from us." Well, the tactical police force of the of the police department, one of these new kind of paramilitary police forces or branches that all the police departments had created during the 60s to deal with violence, not unlike the response to the draft riot, remember, creating a paramilitary police forces. Well, local police forces in New York and Los Angeles did the same thing. And they were the ones who were now sent in additional numbers to quell what they saw as a riot, but what the gay men saw finally as protest. The resistance grew, so did the violence, and it moved into open rebellion. The Stonewall was virtually destroyed in the ensuing struggle. And sporadic fighting continued on Christopher Street for most of the next week. The key is that things were never the same. Expectations, notions of rights fundamentally changed for gay people. in New York, and as news spread to gay communities in San Francisco and Los Angeles and elsewhere in America. And it would never be the same. A new political consciousness emerged in the gay community. A commitment to coming out, a notion that what they had been doing before was somehow personally immoral, to say, to not acknowledge who you were and to fight the categories, the categorization of the psychiatric community. The word and the identity as gay becomes not a stigma, but now becomes proudly adopted by this community, much as, in fact, the word queer would become adopted in decades following. Not as a sign of condemnation, of critique, but as a sign of, by inverting the term, as a sign of one's proud identity. The city, for the first time, forms a Gay Liberation Front and a Gay Activist Alliance in 1969. The Village Voice, at that time, it should be noted, refuses to print the word gay in an advertisement for the Gay Liberation Front. So even the Village Voice was the most liberal kind of voice in New York City, and in that community took another year before it was willing to accept the transformation that was going on. A year later, June 28th, 1970, a gay pride march from Christopher Street to Central Park. Los Angeles held one simultaneously, and the next year it would spread to other urban gay centers. The Stonewall, that's to say, became a turning point that would lead in time to the gay men's health crisis, to housing works, many of you know, in support of the gay men's health crisis, and a new kind of political consciousness in New York City and elsewhere. But it would also, as you can imagine, simply be yet another indication to other New Yorkers that the city was going from bad to worse, was now hell in a wastebasket, that everything was in fact upside down, and the city was now a sign of decadent immorality, in which gay people were proudly going on the streets and advertising their immorality. And a third conflict, which I wish to end today, illustrates how all of these kinds of struggles came together and brings the story back to you at NYU. It illustrates what had become, in fact, not simply a form of new political alliances, but a fundamental new culture conflict that would become evident in New York City at this moment and would remain a marker of New York and American cultural politics for the next 4 decades, right through to the present. Early on the morning of May 8th, 1970, we go to the 3rd year in a row, several high school and college students, including from New York University, began a memorial for 4 students shot on May 4th by the National Guard at Kent State. It begins, that's to say, as anti-war protest, but as a memorial service, that's all. Very radical, as you can imagine, memorial service. The rally swelled by noon to 1,000 people, and they marched to Federal Hall. They called for an end to the war in Vietnam and the war in Cambodia, to which the war had spread. They called for the release of all political prisoners in the United States. A loose term, however, that was meant to relate to people who were involved in protesting the war, but could be a larger kind of critique of what would emerge later as the prison industrial complex. That's to say, a prison system that seemed to disproportionately incarcerate people of color in America. And they call for the end to military-related research on college campuses. Someone had asked me earlier about the bombing at NYU. That's what that was an effort to deal with. The protest consequence was engaging many of the kinds of issues that had become hot-button issues for everyone in New York City. Protest against the war. Protests that seemed to be endangering to some people, the sons and uncles and nephews who were fighting that war, because it was undermining the morale of the troops. It was going to undermine the ability of the government in calling for the end of the war. It was going to undermine the commitment of the government to providing those troops with what they thought were all the bombs that were needed to wipe out hostile resistance in Vietnam. So it was seen as, the anti-war protest was seen as protest that was jeopardizing a struggle in which many of the white ethnics in the outer boroughs had sons, or they themselves had been fighting as veterans in the war. So the protest is not simply protest, it's an attack in its own way, easily can be seen as an attack on a way of life called the American way of life, as understood by these white ethnics whose sons and daughters had been fighting that war or in support of that war. So 5 minutes before noon in Federal Hall, 200 construction workers converged on the students from 4 sides. Nearly all of them were carrying American flags. Their numbers were likely swollen by other counter-demonstrators. But that's to say they are fighting against the anti-war demonstrators in the name of American patriotism. And they're fighting it from the base of themselves as construction workers, resonating with a workforce that had become hyper-identified with a community seen as under assault by equal opportunity commissions and by a group of people who also had been fighting in the war or saw their sons and daughters fighting in the war. Before the riot ends, the construction workers also attack buildings near City Hall associated with that patrician mayor and anti-war mayor John Lindsay. And they storm 2 buildings of Pace University because they saw college kids as also reflecting and involved in this kind of anti-patriotic activity. So for the construction workers, the enemy are college kids. Not necessarily all of you. They imagine, however, it's all college kids. So they break windows at the university and they beat students with crowbars and clubs. 70 people are injured, including 4 politicians. Only 6 were arrested because the police were largely sympathetic to the protest. This, of course, is known as the Hard Hat Riot in New York City's history. There are characteristics of the rioters' behavior that stand out. The rioting construction workers focused their attack on students with long hair. I will share with you a personal anecdote. When I was in the university in the, well, it would have been around 63, 62, 63. And I've told you that I was a freedom rider and I organized Students for Democratic Society at the University of Rochester. And a group of us, I think 16 of us, were given permission to form a group living experiment. We were given a wing of a dormitory where we all lived. And one night, a group of men from one of the fraternities all came over to attack us with scissors. They wanted to cut our hair. That was the symbolic protest that they wanted to engage. They felt that they could somehow, in cutting our hair, it would emasculate us. It's a long biblical story you all know about, but there you are. So that's what was being reflected here as well. They focus on students with long hair, which had become a metaphor, a symbol for gay life, for radical life. The rioters wore, in contrast to that, they came wearing hard hats, a symbol of manliness. The construction worker, by the 20th century, had replaced the blacksmith as the forge as the symbol for Nixon's Middle America. These are the famous Lewis Hine photos in the building of the Empire State Building of construction workers. They give you a sense of some of that kind of heroic pictures of labor in the early 20th century. more such pictures that you would see from the period. The construction industry. Apprenticeship programs had always excluded women and minorities, even as part of an effort to claim there was a need for white male bonding. In 1969, exactly at the moment, just before all of this, the federal government had passed what they called the Philadelphia Plan, in which the government mandated a model setting specific goals for minority hiring. So construction industry in particular had felt that there was an assault that the federal government and cities were now waging on their industry and on the work culture of their industry, which was about maleness and whiteness. Women were not seeking such jobs, but the media represented them at the same time as burning bras, as picketing the Miss America contest, as arguing that they demanded a place outside the home and that somehow they weren't defeminized by holding a job. Only days before the riot, in fact, the Senate held its first hearings on an Equal Rights Amendment. So it was in the air, the idea of women taking on new roles and having new rights. And the police had been involved in similar engagement in political protest. At exact same time, would be at the same time in Chicago, the riots surrounding the Chicago Convention, that would be described by the Walker Commission as a police riot. And so it could be argued that in fact the police, in supporting the construction workers, were engaging in a kind of social protest in which they identify with the assault that they see of women and blacks and liberals on their work culture, on their livelihood, on their jobs, on their children's jobs. What the Walker Commission would be a police riot, from the police is a form of social protest as well. And finally, of course, all these gay men out on the streets, coming out of the closet and fighting back. The response, I would argue, in this riot of the Hard Hat was what historians would describe as a hyper-exaggerated masculinity. Construction workers had always reflected the long-standing general patriarchal world work of men. They were the archetypal proletarians, brawny, what one historian called constructive heroism, you see in the hind photo before. There was a highly sexualized male subculture of construction workers. Easy work on the job was called tit work. Hard work was bull work. Loafing was fucking the dog. The preponderance of jokes on the workplace were about dykes or fags, both used as terms to insult others. So male culture was a highly racialized but also deeply sexualized work culture. And the male gaze obviously was a part of that culture, watching the windows. Often men with binoculars harassing passing women became more common, especially when women in the 70s tried to enter the trades. Bosses commonly gave nude calendars to women. I've got one more little picture to give you a sense. The Marlboro Man, again, that kind of male culture. That was predominant in advertising. The Hard Hat crisis, that conclusion was a crisis of middle America and working class masculinity. The pro-war construction workers singled out during their riot long-haired protesters for insults by calling them fags as they beat them. One young female New York City official grabbed the jacket of a construction worker about to thrash a student, and he turns to her and says, "If you want to be treated like an equal, we'll treat you like one." And with two mates, he then proceeds to break her glasses and punches her so hard she has to be taken to the hospital as well. So what do we conclude? Well, after all of these strikes of Ocean Hill, Brownsville, we see new political alliances forged in New York City that mark the triumph of conservatism in City Hall. The Hard Hat Riot illustrates the social divide that propelled this conservative tide and gave it a gendered and racialized valence. The neoconservatives in City Hall would mark their resurgence in the outer boroughs and the white ethnics as a counterpart to Manhattan, which becomes a world apart. It remains a left liberal center and multicultural, and its ethos in the city. The Hard Hat Riot would help to maintain the white male dominance of the construction jobs, and they would remain in place. In August of 1991, women would constitute 46% of the civilian labor force, but only 2% of construction jobs. At a time when blacks and Hispanics each made up over 9% of the industry. Government was not about to meddle either and promote more change. Richard Nixon, his response was to invite leaders of the New York City Building Trades Council to the White House after the riot, and proudly accept a hard hat labeled Commander-in-Chief. And in 1972, he turns to the president of the New York City Building Trades Council, Peter Brennan, who had endorsed and promoted and spread the hard hat demonstration, and he makes him Secretary of Labor. So the final irony is one can resist a culture, but the driving ambitions of market capitalism and consumption do not allow people to control a culture even as they might like it. By the mid-70s, ironically, a person with long hair was as likely to be a construction worker himself or ride a motorcycle, much like the Marlboro Man. The person wearing blue jeans was as likely to be a college student. The only difference, of course, he'd have to pay 4 times as much for the right designer label. See you next time.